first speaker this morning is Dr. John Brandenburg. Dr. Brandenburg is a plasma physicist. He's from Medford, Oregon originally. And John works for a private company. And John is one of the co-authors of one of our books, Case of the Face. And he's well-known as a Mars researcher and also as a physicist working on Tesla-type technology and unified field kind of science. So please give me a warm welcome for Dr. John Brandenburg.
Thanks, John. Great honor to be here, Dave. Thank you. It's a great honor to be here addressing this conference, and I can vouch, as a scientist, a physicist, I can vouch for a lot of what Dave has been saying, that mainstream science, if they run into something that they can't explain or the implications are unsettling, it simply becomes unspoken. The Olmecs are an example. They look African. Very African. And they also consist, their major testament to us consists of giant carved heads wearing helmets. In fact, I was going to put one of those faces in my talk today, but at the last minute I decided I had too many slides, so so Dave will talk about the Olmec heads. The way to understand what we're finding on Mars maybe through the Olmecs in some paranormal way, even though the civilizations may have been separated by 500 million years. I'm going to talk this morning briefly about what is unspoken now in Mars science. In fact, what is unspeakable. I am going to utter unspeakable things that are now concrete science from Mars. Please, a report from Mars. This is the first appearance of the face on Mars. It was in science fiction in 1958. We are indebted to Dick Hoagland, whom I'm very proud to have worked with in the early parts of the Mars investigation. And he discovered that this had appeared in Kirby Comics. And I probably read this comic book when I was a kid. We were pre-programmed to find the face on Mars. And that's something that mainstream science will not talk about. But that burning image of a humanoid face on Mars was apparently so powerful it transcended space-time and spoke to us at the dawn of the space age. They just launched Sputnik when this comic book came out. The story they find on Mars inside the face, by the way, when they explore it, is that Mars was destroyed by yet another extraterrestrial and more advanced civilization that came to Mars and attempted to conquer it, couldn't conquer it, and destroyed the entire planet in their frustration. Next. Questions. What have we found on Mars with all the recent probes? And second, what have we covered up? I'll address the first one. The unspeakable science of Mars. This is what Mars looked like apparently until recent geologic time. The reason we know that is the Mars Polar Lander landed on the northern plains of Mars, found an ice layer 6 inches below the surface. That used to be ocean. It's as smooth as a billiard ball up there. There are no craters. That means that part of Mars is young. Geologically. It hasn't, the way they date things on Mars is how many craters does it have? More craters, more age since its last resurfacing. The northern parts of Mars are where the ocean bed was, and they are the youngest parts of Mars. And based on the fact that Mars gets a lot more craters per year than the Moon does, we can approximately date the time of the last of the great ocean, northern ocean of Mars, which makes, basically, if you have liquid water on the surface of a planet, it means it defines terrestrial conditions. They had an atmosphere, roughly 1 atmosphere. They had temperatures of the liquid support water. And this was supported apparently by a massive CO2 and methane greenhouse. Next. This is what killed Mars, apparently. This is the Chicxulub of Mars. And all of the stuff I'm presenting, by the way, has been presented at scientific conferences, mainstream scientific conferences. This is called the Leo impact crater. It's as big as Chicxulub that wiped out the dinosaurs, only it happened on a planet only half the size of Earth. It only got half the sunlight. So on Earth, the Chicxulub event killed 95% of all the living things on Earth. But the biosphere had suffered a serious wound, but it recovered after a few million years, and the age of mammals began. The dinosaurs were wiped out, the mammals took over, and eventually leading to us. On Mars, this impact was so terrible, it killed the biosphere. The wound was mortal because of the fragility of the Martian climate system. Mars probably died in 1 day. Next. Here's what else we know. Mars is red. The Earth is also red. This is the Sahara Desert. The areas of Earth that are not covered by water or forest or clouds are bright red. They are red because of oxidized iron. That's the same reason Mars is red. The reason Earth is red is because it's got oxygen in its atmosphere. Lava is full of iron. It comes out, it's black because that's iron in its lowest oxidation state, the ferrous state. It then accepts another oxygen, becomes ferric iron, called hematite, same as the color of our blood. And for the same reason, bright red, highly oxygenated iron. Mars is covered at depth with highly oxygenated iron. Apparently, it had an oxygen-rich atmosphere in the past. That means photosynthesis. Mars had probably a massive biosphere before it died. And Mars' biosphere, this massive biosphere, probably lasted for 4 billion years, almost as long as Earth's, and was probably just as prolific. The story on Mars is even stranger than this. And now we're getting to highly unspeakable things in science. Something happened after the Leo impact. The Leo impact was here. Something else happened here in Mare Acidalium. By the way, Cydonia is right here, right in between these two great catastrophes. This last catastrophe I'm going to speak of was even worse than the Leo impact, the Chicxulub of Mars. And apparently it was a nuclear catastrophe, which is very, very difficult to explain in terms of natural phenomenon. We have on Earth found that there are natural nuclear reactors that formed in uranium deposits. They formed, by the way, with the aid of biology, because bacteria, for some reason, like to concentrate uranium. Apparently, they were using the radioactivity of uranium as a fuel source. One theory for what happened is that something like that happened on Mars, but on a much more massive scale than it happened on Earth. They found 7 different sites where there were natural nuclear reactors. They're amazed that none of them exploded. They basically would get really hot, drive the water out. The groundwater, they were in the groundwater. The groundwater table would get really hot in this reactor core, would drive all of it out by steam. You would see steam geysers 1 billion years ago. By the way, all the uranium on Earth was reactor grade 1 billion years ago. It was 3% uranium-235, which is modern reactor grade. On Mars, apparently, though, something very massive occurred. Next slide. This is the slide of uranium of the xenon found in the Martian atmosphere. These are the stable isotopes of xenon. And you'll notice this big spike. Here, the blue one is Earth. It matches the rest of the xenon except at 129. 129 is produced by the decay of iodine-129, which is produced in nuclear explosions. It's also produced in nuclear reactors. But what produces your xenon-129 very quickly in enormous amounts is a nuclear explosion. So if there was a natural reactor on Mars that formed because of Mars groundwater, perhaps after the Leo impact, which shifted water underground, the explosion was equal to all of the hydrogen bombs detonated on Earth, detonated at once. Here is the radioactive scar left afterwards. A bright red spot on Mars, that's radioactive potassium. Mars rocks have less potassium and thorium than Earth rocks. We know that because we have Mars meteorites. But the surface of Mars appears to have normal Earth standard potassium and thorium. So this is very hard to explain, so scientists simply just don't talk about it. And the fact is that all of the thorium is concentrated at two places on Mars, that big red spot in Mare Acidalium and a smaller red spot on the exact opposite side of the planet. And this is typically what you find in a large explosion on a planet. You find a big crater on one side and a pile of debris on the exact other side because the shock waves wrap around the planet and focus on the far side. So that big this red spot here is almost the exact antipode of this. And this apparently came over the pole, is on the other side of the pole, reached over the pole. You had raying effects like you get on Copernicus crater on the moon. This is Mars thorium, same pattern. This is almost completely inexplicable unless there's only one way to explain this. A large nuclear explosion, like a large nuclear reactor of massive proportions compared to what they found on Earth, created itself on Mars and exploded. The other big problem, I'll tell you why this is doubly unspeakable. There's no big crater at this place. There's just a big burn spot, which suggests it was an airburst, not buried underground. And the only people who can make airburst nuclear explosions are people like us. It's possible, of course, to bury a uranium or thorium-rich asteroid in Mars and then saturate it with water and with some bacteria concentrating everything, get a natural nuclear reactor. But that would seem to form a large crater when it exploded. This explosion seems to have left no crater, just a big burn spot on the ground. So there, I've told you unspeakable things. Apparently, not only did Mars die in a day, leading to a planetary mass extinction, the first extraterrestrial mass extinction we will find in the cosmos, but also apparently first it perished with ice and then with fire. So it's very strange, and both of these events occurred near Cydonia, bracketing it. We will be discussing this in a forthcoming book that Dave and I are working out now called Life and Death on Mars, the New Mars Synthesis, Mass Extinction and Nuclear Catastrophe on Mars, which will come out soon, I hope. Anyway, so that's basically my report from Mars. Next. Of mainstream science. I also wish to cross T's and dot I's regarding Cydonia. As it turns out, I can say, quite frankly at this point, the UFO cover-up views Mars as a sideshow. The same forces in the government that have told you not to worry about the lights in the sky periodically moving around have also told you, imagine a bunch of guys in trench coats standing there saying, move along, folks, there's nothing here to see. Remember Men in Black? Tommy Lee Jones, I love that phrase. Move along here, folks, nothing here to see. Just imagine him, and I worked with some of these guys in Washington, D.C., I swear, because I worked with various people at the Pentagon, and all I needed to do was imagine them in charge of this stuff, and I know that's just what they would say. So this picture is what they released. And it's the poorest Mars picture ever released. There's no computer enhancement. In fact, when they released it reversed, just to confuse the eye even more. This is what happened when Mark Carlotto, who strangely enough also works for the Pentagon, enhanced it. Sometimes, in fact, we get the impression there are two forces within the government, one of which wants disclosure, wants to dribble out information, and another faction that is arm wrestling it says that nothing should come out. That final picture is what happened when Mark Carlotto used a three-dimensional model that he had obtained from the Viking pictures to transform this image and see what it would be when we viewed it from above. By the way, the people at JPL were very clever. They took the picture from the side so that people were expecting a picture like this, straight down from above, like the Viking pictures. No, they knew better. They took it from the side. So they tried to create maximum confusion for the human eye. This is what it looks like. Notice the nostrils and the nose, the two eyes, the mouth, the ornaments in the helmet. It's all there. It was all there in front of us. They were clever in that they waited till the very last moment to release the picture to the news media, knowing that all the news media had to file by 6 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. So that's all they released. And that's all the world saw. End of story. Move along, folks. Nothing here to see. Please look at the light, as in Men in Black. There's a you have to have a sense of humor about this. Sometimes after seeing what grisly things have been found, I kind of even wonder if I was in the government, would I do the same thing they're doing? I think not. Here I am. This is Odyssey 2005. Why, it looks like a face. And that looks like a pyramid. Nothing has changed. It still looks like it looks like. It looks like a carved face in a helmet, looks very much like the Olmecs. And the pyramid looks like a five-sided pyramid. Very strange that nature would carve two such distinctly different shapes so close to each other. It is a wonderment. But any good geologist, by the way, can argue that natural forces can carve both of these things next to each other. And next, which is why it's even more interesting that there are two other faces on Mars in a place called Utopia on the other side of the planet, also on the shores of the ancient ocean. Cydonia was on the shore of the ancient ocean of Mars. It was the Riviera of Mars. In fact, that was where they wanted to land. The first Viking lander was in Cydonia. But then after taking a bunch of pictures, they decided not to. In fact, even that decision is full of controversy. No one can figure out who made the decision. It wasn't the people in charge of the mission, as it turns out. Suddenly they got the pronouncement that Cydonia was too rocky to land the Viking lander in. So they landed it someplace else. They landed at a place north of this area called Utopia. Here, this object and this object, in a book that Vince DePietro and I wrote, we analyzed this. We found out that here's two eyes, nose, and mouth, and there's a mark on the cheek, and apparently you find the same markings on the original face. This face, however, is only 2/3 the size, and we only had one good picture of it, whereas in Cydonia we had two good images taken a month apart. So, but David has in his possession a copy of the book where this is all discussed with a new image addendum. So that's really my report from Mars. Nothing has changed on Mars except the depth to which we are cynical about our government's ability to disclose facts. Next. Oh, yeah, the next talk on the GEM. Believe it or not, friends, I got involved in Mars kind of by accident. I'm a trained scientist, I'm a problem solver, but my main training is that I'm a theoretical plasma physicist. I worked on nuclear fusion, tokamaks, for basically weaving magnetic fields to control plasma so that we could do what the stars do. Because fusion lights and heats the universe. It is, in fact, one of the other terrible things I found out is that this government probably could have had controlled fusion putting power into the grid 10 years ago. But they ended the fusion research under the Reagan administration, or they just started shutting it down, and the price of oil dropped just by coincidence when they did this. So if you want to get the price of oil to drop again, fund the fusion program in this country. That is a much safer, cleaner form of nuclear power. But anyway, I digress. My major life's work has been gravity electromagnetism unification theory, the GEM theory. Next. First of all, I want you to know what happens when a society discovers a unification theory. The first really powerful unification theory was developed by this fellow. Next. And what he did was he unified electricity and magnetism and light. Electricity, light, magnetism all came together to form what's called E&M theory. And that is what has made our civilization. Next. I'm going to talk about progress on the EM gravity unification. Planck, Einstein, Sakharov, de Hooft, and I should add Tesla. The calculation of the gravitation constant, and discuss in summary. Next. Unifying gravity and electromagnetism was Einstein's last great quest. However, he hated quantum mechanics. And as it turns out, that was probably the crucial thing to unifying gravity and electromagnetism. You can't unify gravity and E&M as with taking gravity as a classical field like E&M and gravity. You have to include quantum mechanics. Next. The person who introduced quantum mechanics introduced it to electromagnetic theory. This is Max Planck. And he was a protege of Einstein. He invited Einstein to come to Germany to work after he had done his great work in a patent office. Planck's great contribution was to show that he could figure out the electromagnetic field in a dark cavity that had what's called a black body, a cavity, and it gets full of electromagnetic radiation, but the electromagnetism is made of particles of electromagnetism, quanta. So he invented quantum mechanics. Next. He invented the power law that says the color of things when they get hot. And you can only understand that with quantum mechanics. That's why the great constant he discovered is called Planck's constant. And what's interesting, in the middle of his formula, sigma, called the Stefan-Boltzmann constant, is 6 pi to the 5th power. Remember that. The number 5 has appeared, along with pi. Next. Now, we all know who this guy was. He was more of an a seat-of-the-pants electrical engineer, but he was a genius. And he invented the concept of what I call, in his honor, the Tesla vortex, rotating electromagnetic fields using 3-phase power. When you pass all the power lines here, you'll notice the ones on big insulators, they're grouped in groups of 3. That's because of this guy. He powered our civilization and made electromagnetism that Clerk Maxwell had unified into a practical thing for our civilization. He also claimed at the end of his life that by using rotating electromagnetic fields, he could nullify gravity. Next. When he died, by the way, all his papers were confiscated and are still classified. So just moving right along, I'm going to talk about gravity electromagnetism. Also stands for the Latin phrase grandis et medianus, because it has cosmological implications. And it's an alloy of Sakharov's zero-point fluctuation theory of gravity. The person who made gravity into 0 point, linked gravity and 0 point, is Sakharov, the great Russian scientist, and Kaluza-Klein, fifth dimensional approaches. Sakharov said that gravity is a push. It's pressure from an electromagnetic field that's all around us from the 0 point fluctuation of quantum mechanics. And Sakharov knew all about radiation pressure because he was working on the Russian hydrogen bomb, which runs on radiation pressure. Here's how his 0 point fluctuation gravity works. If you have two bright objects in a dark box, they will repel each other due to mutual radiation pressure, the pressure of light. If the walls of the box are dark compared to these two objects. However, if you put two dark objects in a white-hot box, they will be pushed together by the radiation pressure of the walls. Because if you stand on one, you see all around you white-hot metal except for a black dot. That's the other object. And that casts a little bit of a shadow, so they attract each other with a 1 over r squared. Basically, it's a few steps beyond this to make a hydrogen bomb. It used to be classified, but now it isn't. You basically have a white-hot box full of hydrogen, and the hydrogen is crushed by the radiation pressure from the walls. So, this is how Sakharov's theory of gravity works. That what we're seeing is variations in the 0 point fluctuation causing a radiation pressure. Now, Kaluza-Klein, fifth dimension. Why 5 dimensions? 5 is easy to count. Also, there are 5 platonic solids. And the last one, the most complicated one, is the dodecahedron with 5-sided faces. If you have a 3-dimensional space, you can only write 5 platonic solids because the underlying dimensionality that we live in is actually 5-dimensional, not x, y, and z, and then time. That's because the 5th dimension is curled up. The 5th dimension, by the way, the number 5 gives you psi, the golden ratio. Next. Now, if you want to know what a hidden dimension looks like, imagine an ant crawling on a sheet of typing paper. He can crawl in the x direction, the y direction, anywhere he wants, assuming it's a big sheet of paper. But in the vertical, he can only have up the thickness of the typing paper or down the thickness. He can be on the bottom or the top. So he can move all over here, but he can only be here or here in the z direction. The z direction in this model is the hidden dimension. The identity of the hidden dimension physically is charge itself. This is why you only get charge in little bits. A plus bit, the proton, a negative bit, the electron. Next. Hawking showed that if you had a black hole, it would decay. A black hole is where a star or something other piece of matter has crushed itself out of existence. There's nothing there but gravity. The original matter is gone. Space-time has basically tied a knot in itself that it can't undo. However, using quantum mechanics, the black body radiation and the energy in the gravity fields actually turns into heat radiation, light, and the thing explodes and turns into pure electromagnetism. So here you see gravity field, electromagnetism, but it doesn't turn into a pure electromagnetic field like a charge or anything like that. It turns into particles of electromagnetism. And that's how you understand gravity is particles of electromagnetism, not macroscopic electric and magnetic fields. Next. So you can say that mainstream physics is actually getting closer to full E&M gravity unification. Now, one of the nice things that has happened, in my opinion, is people added a 5th dimension to space-time theory in Kaluza-Klein. This is what Kaluza-Klein did. And they found that if you had 4 dimensions, you could get gravity, the theory of gravity of Einstein. If you added a 5th dimension, then another piece falls out, and that's electromagnetism. The same Maxwell's equations and gravity equations linked together fall out of the same theory if you add the fifth dimension. Now, so you get a good thing from adding a fifth dimension. So the string theory people said, well, if you get a good thing from adding one new dimension, if you add 27, it must be even better, right? And as a result, no one knows what any of these 22nd new dimensions do. And in fact, string theory is now being dismissed as a weird cult. And this, by the way, this weird cult has absorbed probably $50 million of National Science Foundation funding that otherwise would have probably gone to solving just a five-dimensional theory and solving E&M. But it left the field clear for me because I've been publishing. And in fact, I'm going to a big conference in July and presenting all of this that I'm showing you. Next, I've presented at many conferences, by the way, and been ignored, but that's okay. I like being ignored now because it means I get to work on this thing and other people don't. The theory is based on that gravity is made of particles of E&M electromagnetism, and the other part of the theory is that gravity and protons, E&M and gravity, were united at what's called the Planck scale, where little black holes, quantum black holes form and collapse. That makes the 0-point fluctuation from the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And that everything is fine until you suddenly add a fifth dimension to that, and then suddenly out of that can unfold electromagnetism as we understand it. Gravity and electromagnetism suddenly tear apart. And at the same time that the vacuum tears apart, it forms a plus and a minus charge, which is the proton and the electron. So the vacuum is actually unstable in this theory. If you have a cubic yard of pure vacuum and stare at it for 5 billion years, suddenly there'll be a spark of light in there, and out of it will come a positive and a negative charge, a proton and an electron. That's hydrogen. That's apparently how the universe runs. That's why there's so much hydrogen in the universe, by coincidence. Next, you can tell I have fun with this, especially with the string theorists, who can't explain anything that we see. They have kabuki-yar spaces, but they can't explain why the universe is 99% hydrogen and only has two forces that run things on large. Electromagnetism and gravity run the universe. Two forces and two particles, 99% hydrogen. So to explain how you can get electromagnetism and gravity unified, if you have two plates with electric field across them and a magnetic field coming out of the wall like this, and you put any particle in there, they'll all start floating at the same velocity, irregardless of charge or mass. You can put a proton, an electron, a charged zinc atom, they'll all end up moving it the same way. Next. So that's for straight plates. If you bend the plates, adding curvature, or change this in time, the particles accelerate. And they all accelerate at the same rate. And this has all been published, by the way. So, E cross B gravity, you can make things macroscopically for single charged particles that looks just like gravity. Next. And in fact, you can even simulate it. Here's a proton, and here's an electron. They kind of do a little zigzag path, but they both end up accelerating the same way. Next. Now, as I mentioned, all of this has very interesting implications for the cosmos. In the cosmos, you've got lots of vacuum, and it's full of zero-point energy. It's got more zero-point energy in it that the matter energy is just a perturbation. It's nothing compared to how much zero-point energy there is. By the way, these are all galaxies. This is a Hubble Deep Field. We're all in debt to the Hubble telescope for really showing us the universe as it is. Imagine if you were emperor of one of these galaxies, how important you would be in the grand scheme of things. I decided to give up my ambition to be emperor of that galaxy after seeing this picture, that it was too small an ambition. But this is how God sees us, by the way. He sees us right there. Next. The navel of the universe. As it turns out, the universe had a mother. We know that because she has a navel, a very beautiful navel, and we know the size of her navel that connected her by an umbilical cord of physics to her birth. Next. The birth of the cosmos apparently came about when this fifth dimension arrived. Gravity, E and M broke apart, the proton, the electron, so you had hydrogen and you had electromagnetic fields and gravity. Next. And one of the interesting things is, why is the proton so much heavier than the electron? Next. As it turns out, the mass of the proton to the mass of the electron is almost exactly 6 times pi to the 5th. No one can explain this until now. Apparently, the proton is full of hot electromagnetism, and the electron is cold. That's how it is. The electron, remember, the 6 pi to the 5th is in the Stefan Boltzmann constant. By the way, this has just been published. I went and presented a paper just on this subject at a conference in Ohio about 2 months ago. The square root of this number apparently is what the universe really likes. And that's 42.85, just like in Hitchhiker's Guide. The secret to the universe is 42. Science fiction, once again, teaming to be prophetic. Next. This leads, by the way, to a formula for the gravitation constant, and it's good to within a part per thousand. Instead of 6.67, it's 6.668. Good, close enough for government work. This has already been published and has been dismissed as numerology. I have been known now as a numerologist who likes to sit around Sunday afternoons with my calculator and come up with weird, it's okay, it's okay. This is how science treats people when they're saying unspeakable things. Next. By the way, it's within a part per thousand. That's closer than anybody has ever gotten. In fact, for a while, it was closer than the experimental uncertainty. Next. Applications to human flight. We did an experiment where we took 3-phase power and spun it up in a gyroscope, and we spun it up counterclockwise, and nothing happened. When we spun it up clockwise with the 3-phase electromagnetic field, it lost a tiny amount of weight. It lost a few milligrams. It weighed 100 grams. Next. The reason we were inspired to do this is 2 Japanese had done the same thing and published this in PhysRev Letters. Strangely enough, even though they described their experiment in great detail as spinning things with electromagnetic fields, the 3-phase electromagnetic, somebody from the University of Colorado in the Condon School of Science immediately published an article afterwards where they used a compressed air gyro. They spun up the rotor with compressed air, and they saw no weight loss. So they said, Tamaguchi and Hayasaka, they're crackpots. They don't know what they're doing. We got money and did reproduce the original experiment. So if you do 3-phase rotating power, the Tesla vortex, you start seeing weakening of gravity. Next. The Tesla pointing vortex. The vector, by the way, when you cross an electromagnetic, cross an E field and a B field, that gives the radiation pressure vector in light. That's called a pointing vector. I just call it now, I've dropped pointing. It points in the direction of electromagnetic energy pressure. Tesla vortex in Tesla's honor. Next. And apparently, we can harness gravity. I think, as Joe will talk, this was apparently discovered by the Germans during World War II. The problem is it takes a lot of power, and they didn't have the power available, which is why we're not all speaking German. So we're grateful for that. Apparently, the German is a difficult language. I learned Russian, which I thought was easy. My daughter is learning German, so she's schooling me on Ach and Mittensie and things like this. Anyway, so we have the beginnings of this theory. Next. This is, by the way, what it looks like when you try to make something that flies. You have a dome that confines the electromagnetic field down here. We call this the vacuum Bernoulli effect, by the way. Instead of the curved surface making air go faster up here and slower down here, you have electromagnetic field going faster down here and no electromagnetic field up here because the metal confines it, and the pressure of the gravity field actually pushes. Next. Anyway, this gem theory says that cold E&M and gravity can be interchanged without black holes. We don't need Hawking's black hole. We don't need to make a black hole. Next. Someday you will see this, and you will plant your tongue firmly in cheek and smile and wave at the nice Air Force people, and they will be showing off their toy, probably fusion powered, and you'll say, you know, that design looks familiar, and they will frown and say, that's not possible. We came up with this ourselves. Look what we discovered. And so you have to keep a sense of humor in this thing. In the Mars work, we called this the Dance of the Seven Veils, where the government finally takes off the last veil, and you see things, and apparently great progress is being made. If you want to watch an interesting movie, I believe it's called, it's either The Ambushers or Murderers Row. It was Dean Martin's. And the first scene is this thing taken off in the desert, Site 51. I recommend all you go watch it. Just watch the first 5 minutes. I love the show, by the way. I love Dean Martin and his lovely co-star in that movie. She was an Israeli actress, I guess. Anyway, future air show. Next. We can go beyond this, from just bending space-time, which gives us what we had on the last flight, to tying it in knots, making our own wormholes. Next. Faster than light drive. Next. So anyway, this theory is an alloy of Sakharov and Kaluza-Klein, fifth dimension. All you need is the 5 dimensions, this 22 dimension stuff. They're trying to unify everything. They're trying to unify quarks and neutrinos and everything. Instead of a Jeep, they want a Cadillac with gold trim. And that's okay. In the meantime, I'm providing people with a Jeep theory. Next. There. And I believe this is where the human race will end up, fully integrating fully interacting with the cosmos in our own starship someday, which of course is, if you ignore this part, in fact, what Star Trek showed us, we'll have our own flying saucers, but we'll soup them up a little bit, give them faster, bigger engines. Next, we are living science fiction, and therefore I was inspired by all of this, by the fact that I saw all of these ideas in science fiction. I decided to start writing science fiction of my own, partly because I can talk about the gem theory here, but funny things happen to people in this country who start talking too much about UFOs and their connection with real life. And I know that. And so I decided the best way to do that, especially working in the industry, was to write science fiction. So I have started my own story of the human saga starting tomorrow, that starts tomorrow in my novels. Next. The human saga begins. This is a new novel that's just coming out this summer. Asteroid 20-2012 Sepulveda. And if you want to know the real backstory in this novel, this is a space crisis that the government originally keeps secret. They spot an asteroid and they have 1 year to do something about it. And it's as big as the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. They can't make it go away, and eventually they know they're going to have to tell the public about it, even if it's only the day before it hits. And the government doesn't know whether to dig holes and hide itself or try to set off nuclear weapons to deflect it. But there's another entity within the government complicating matters. And that working group goes by the name of the Magi. And they say, we're in charge of this asteroid. You don't do anything about it. This is all secret. It's behind 7 closed doors. And the Magi says, we are in charge of space problems. They tell the Air Force, don't do anything about this asteroid till we tell you you can. So there's a problem. This is an outer space crisis that could happen tomorrow. Yesterday, a kid in Germany got hit with a piece of a meteorite. Make the meteorite bigger, you get the one in Arizona. My neighbor was witness to a meteor as big as a house going over the Grand Tetons in Montana that almost triggered a nuclear war. It happened in the early 70s. This could happen tomorrow to us. Tazunga in Siberia, things happen in the cosmos. And as the saying here says, the cosmos plays hardball. When it plays really rough. So next, the saga continues. The sequel to that novel, I wrote the first novel and then I wrote the prequel, Morning Star Pass, the collapse of the UFO cover-up. The blonde is the same one. Absolute secrecy creates absolute power, my friends. You have in this novel, in fiction, I imagine an entity in the government called the Magi who have absolute power, life or death power. Because the secrets they guard are absolutely secret. The Constitution, don't bring up trifles to us. The first law of the Constitution is survival. And that's their operating moderandi. So I've written both these books. This one's available on Amazon.com. So is the other one. So enjoy. This is my view of the saga of the human race as it will unfold. So thank you very much, and it's been a great honor. Thank you, Dave.